All right, it's about that time. Um, all right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Today is October 11th, 2020, and this is the Faith and Function class. I feel like I'm a AM radio host who has to give station identification every 10 minutes. Our speaker today is Dr. Steve McKenzie from Rhodes College. The topic is Apocalyptic Literature. Next week, we'll have Dr. Patrick Gray for the first of a 2-week series on the letter to the Hebrews. And so it's going to be the same channel, same place. Are there any announcements that we should know about? And if you're like me, you will have forgotten to unmute yourself before you started talking. Anything? Are there any joys or concerns? All right, I'll go ahead and say a prayer and then we'll get started. Let's pray. Holy God, your word to us is sometimes confusing and sometimes strange, but it was a comfort to your people then, and I hope that you will teach us how to read it for today. In Jesus' name, amen. Dr. McKenzie, go ahead.
Okay, good to see you all again. And let's see, pull up the right one. Here we go. Everybody see that?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Are you sharing?
Yeah, thought I was. Let's try again.
Oh, it started screen sharing. Yes, we see it now.
But it's not.
It's not a presentation. There it is.
All right, there we go. So good to see you all again. And I want to say off the bat, I really appreciate Daniel's prayer because it really gets to the heart of the topic for the day, apocalyptic literature. So apocalyptic literature that that when we read it, we find very confusing, frankly, for a variety of reasons. And yet the point of it ultimately is comfort. So if you kind of want the two themes of the day, those are they, confusing and comfort. So what I want to try to point out is the reason for the confusion and maybe cut through that a little bit. Not that when we're finished today, you're going to be able to pick up a piece of apocalyptic literature and read it all the way through and understand it completely. But if it's any comfort to you, nobody else can do that either, for the most part. But just to give you some idea of what's going on and suggest that to some extent, maybe you understand it better than you realize you do. But then also to get to the ultimate point of it and explain why it is intended to be comforting. So we'll jump in there, apocalyptic literature. All right, so let me begin. The word to begin with, apocalypse, is a bit confusing because of what it has come to mean and the way it has come to be used in popular culture and on television and so on. You can turn on, there are a lot of, movies, television shows that we're all becoming familiar with these days since we're all tuning into Netflix and so on, streaming, or at least learning about those options, maybe more than we wanted to know. At any rate, there are a lot of things in popular culture, books, television, theater, movies, and so on, that use the term apocalypse even in news items that use the term apocalypse, and they use it in the way that it has kind of come to mean to refer to the end, the end of the world or the end of something. So you might even say, is this the COVID apocalypse or something like that? Some kind of notion of an end that's not a good end, a sort of a crisis end. So we use it that way, but in fact, the word is a Greek word, and it means uncovering or revelation. Okay. We don't think of apocalypse and revelation as synonymous, as the two, as meaning the same thing, but in fact they do. And we have a book in the New Testament called the Book of Revelation. That is also known as the Apocalypse of John. All right. So I want to talk about each of these words because apocalypse and revelation, because they've kind of come to mean different things, but in fact they are related and they are identical in meaning originally. Now there's nothing wrong with words taking on new meanings, nothing at all, but sometimes it's important to understand where they come from and their sort of original setting. So let's talk about revelation first of all. It's revelation dummy. And what I mean by that is that's actually a kind of a quote. So many of you, maybe all of you, know my colleague Steve Haynes. And this is a quote from a story that he told me about a year ago about his son, Braden. His son is a student at CBHS. And the story goes like this, that one day Steve was taking him to school and they were listening, or Steve was listening to some kind of talk radio show in which somebody was talking about the book of Revelations, and they used the plural, Revelations. And when Braden heard that, he said, "It's Revelation, dummy." But actually he used another word other than dummy, but I'm not, he's in middle school or high school at that point. So Steve asked him where this came from, because it sounded kind of like a formula. And Braden said that this was from his teacher, who was a Rhodes alum, who was trying to get them to understand that the name of the book is Revelation, not Revelations. All right. Now that's a small difference, but it's kind of a symptomatic one, one that shows a difference in understanding, a difference in interpretation. Understanding the word is singular sort of shows that you have some grasp of the genre, that you know that this is a type of literature. But if you if you take the word as plural or render it that way, then you tend to see it. That's an immediate sign that whoever uses that term tends to see it as a list or a group or a collection of signs of the end of the world. The book of Revelation is actually much more interesting than that, and as is the genre of apocalyptic. All right, so it's Revelation, singular, and it's not really about the end of the world. So that gets mixed in. That's part of the formula, part of the genre in a way, but it's not the main point. It's not the main focus. And the end of the world is kind of tangential. It's not really the main point of the literature. All right. So let's talk a little about the genre. But before we do that, let me go back to a series of events in our relatively recent history. Go back a couple hundred years, to a series of events that were based on misinterpretations, misconstruals, misunderstandings of what apocalyptic in the Bible is all about. So the first of these took place in the 1840s, when there was a well-known, or kind of who became well-known because of this particular event. This man was named William Miller. He lived in New England. He was a farmer by trade, but also well respected as a self-educated Bible scholar. That ought to give you some clues. Would you go to a self-educated physician? Would you go to a self-educated lawyer? You might raise those kinds of questions. Would you follow investment advice by a self-educated broker? Maybe when you frame it in those terms, it kind of sets a little bit different way of looking at it. At any rate, William Miller persuaded his followers, and the group grew over a period of time, that Christ was going to return sometime between March of 1843 and March of 1844, within that time frame. Now, the way he did that was that he took a verse from the book of Daniel. That, by the way, you might notice is always a clue in these kinds of interpretations, is they tend to focus on one verse or one phrase or one detail or one number. So he took a verse from the book of Daniel, Daniel 8, verse 14, that referred to or used the figure of 2,300 days, which Miller determined in his interpretation was actually 2,300 years. And he decided that that was a prediction of when the world was coming to an end, and that it was counting from the year of Ezra's commission to go to Ezra. Ezra is a book in the Old Testament, and Ezra was a man who was sent back from the Persian court to Jerusalem, to Judah, to rebuild, and reestablish the worship of God, of Yahweh, in the temple in Jerusalem. So Miller determined that that was the beginning point of this time frame, of this focus, 2,300 years. And so what he did was to take 2,300, subtract from that 457, because he was looking for the date AD. So you subtract 457 from 2,300 and you get 1843. And that's how he figured that date. And then the month, the day, March 21st, was based on him figuring out that was the precise day of Ezra's commission, when Ezra was commissioned. All right. He didn't provide a time during the day, but that was as precise as he got. So that's how he reached that figure. All right. What's maybe more interesting is that he persuaded a large number of people, particularly in New England, but not exclusively. And you had people during that year period. This became well known. This was a national phenomenon. People who sold their property, their homes, their farms, their lands, And we're going and camping out on the tops of mountains and hills and waiting for Christ to return. Newsflash, it didn't happen. And so there was always, there had to be reinterpreted, recast, and actually this became one of the influences of what developed into the Seventh-day Adventists that are still with us today. Again, this was reinterpreted, obviously. All right, well, that seems like a quirk in our history. And if you're familiar with American history, you know there are a lot of sort of religious quirks over the years. But bring things a little more within our lifetime. Some of you may remember Hal Lindsey, 1970, published a novel called The Late Great Planet Earth. And I know from looking at you, not all of you, like Daniel, our host, would not fit into this category, but many of us, let's say, were alive in 1970.
But it's okay. My grandma had this book.
Okay, good, good. And some of you may have read it. It was a big bestseller. Some of you will remember in the 70s the Jesus movement, and this was a big influence in the Jesus movement. And what Lindsey did, and by the way, I think Lindsey's still alive. He was, at least of a few years ago, he was still alive and doing some television shows on local cable channels. At any rate, he predicted in 1970 that Christ would return in 1988. Okay? Where did he get that figure? Well, again, based on one verse in this time the New Testament in Matthew, where there was a reference to Jesus saying, "This generation will not pass away until these things come to pass." And so he calculated that one generation was 40 years, at least in Bible terms, that's a round number for a generation. And he determined somehow that the 40 years was to be calculated or begun from 1948, which was the year of the establishment of the State of Israel. So 1948 plus 40 equals 1988, and that was the year that he set for the return of Christ. Well, if you remember 1970, you also remember 1988. And it didn't happen. 1988 came and went, and there was no return of Christ. And so that led to a recalculation and refiguring and so on. And Hal Lindsey went on changing his message a little bit, but he did lose some followers, right? And one of the things you'll notice is these maybe it's a sign of dwindling influence of religion or something in America, or maybe it's just a sign of dwindling influence of these interpretations, but they tend to have less influence over time. And so 2016, a fellow named Zachariah Daniels, who's well known in California in particular, predicts the end of the world in 2016. A little more complicated, but again, you'll notice based on one verse in the book of Daniel, 49 years, because it's 7 weeks. 7 weeks equals 7 times 7 days, so 49 years. Following, he decided the taking by the state of Israel of East Jerusalem. Some of you may know that after 1948, when the state of Israel was established, that actually a large part of what is now Israel still belonged to Jordan, including East Jerusalem, which is mainly Arab Jerusalem, and that remained the case until 1967. You may know the phrase the Six-Day War. That took place in 1967, in which Israel, some of you may remember the Israeli general, and whose name just skipped my mind with the eye patch. Can't think of his name.
Moshe Dayan.
Moshe Dayan.
Moshe Dayan, yeah. Moshe Dayan was the general who led that series of strikes, and Israel took back the Sinai, or took the Sinai, took what is now known as the West Bank, which was Jordan at the time, and also took the East Jerusalem. So all of that happened in 1967. At any rate, that was the basis for Zechariah Daniel's calculation that 2016 was the year when the world would end and Christ would return. Again, if you remember 1970, 1988, and in some cases, even if you weren't born yet, you remember 2016, and it didn't happen. And so came and went, and that's why we're here in 2020. So all of these are misunderstandings of the way apocalyptic literature functions and of its intention. And one of the things that I think you have to understand right off the bat is that apocalyptic literature was never intended to predict the end of the world in this way. All right. In fact, maybe one of the places to start would be to say that apocalyptic literature that we have, to the extent that it predicts the end of the world way back in the first century, or first century BC, first century AD, maybe the second century, but that prediction is long past, all right? Way before any of us were born. So apocalyptic literature is actually a genre of literature that flourished between about 200 BC and 200 AD. Now, it doesn't mean that when you get to 200 AD, there's no more apocalyptic written. You could theoretically write a work of apocalyptic literature today in the same genre, but you'd really be kind of copying that ancient genre. So this is a genre of literature that in a sense is long past, all right? And its primary target, its primary object, its primary references are also in the distant past. The name apocalyptic actually comes from the New Testament book of Revelation, or Apocalypse, the Apocalypse. So the book of Revelation 1:1 begins the revelation of Jesus Christ, or you could translate it the apocalypse of Jesus Christ to his servant John, the uncovering, the revelation. But this was, if we date the book of Revelation, say roughly around 100 AD, this genre of apocalypse had already been flourishing by about 300 years at that point, and would continue to flourish for another century. So it was a type of literature that was in common use at the time period. It didn't have, nobody had given it a genre title, but one of the terms that it used frequently was apocalypse, and so when the genre was recognized as such, as a kind of literature, then it kind of adopted the name Revelation from the book of Revelation in the New Testament. All right. It was literature that, as you can tell from the dates, BC and AD, was both Jewish and Christian in its in the examples that we have, and in its origin was Jewish. It's Jewish literature that Christians then adopted, especially Christians with Jewish roots, Jewish Christians. All right, and in the Bible, though there are other examples of literature that are apocalyptic-like or share some of those features, there are really only two books of the Bible that are apocalyptic. The book of Revelation, you can see it in the title, and then the book of Daniel, and to be more specific, really the second half of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, are apocalyptic literature. And they date roughly Daniel from about 165 or 164 BC, and the book of Revelation, roughly, as I say, about 100, maybe a little later than that, maybe a little earlier than that, in the 90s. At any rate, that gives you some rough idea of when they come. Let me just pause at this point and ask if there are any questions or comments to this point. Okay, so let's talk about features of apocalyptic, how it works. And it's a little complicated, but here's the way that apocalyptic tends to work. So there's a figure from the past, often usually from the distant past. Like, for example, we have a work called The Apocalypse of Adam. You know, the first guy, Adam. So the idea being that this is revelation that Adam received way back at the beginning of the world. Okay? And these are often figures who are in the Bible. Another one we have, Apocalypse's revelation of Enoch, who is a figure also mentioned way back at the beginning of Genesis, or the Apocalypse of Noah. So real early guys. Now, not all of them have to be that early, like way back at the beginning, but many are, and in any case, they are figures typically from the Bible and typically from very early in the Bible. All right? And what the literature then purports to do is to explain or interpret a vision of this character of Adam, in our example, or Enoch. So a vision that Adam had, or a dream that Enoch had. So it describes this vision or series of visions, or this dream or series of dreams that Adam had or that Enoch had. Okay? And what that vision or dream is intended to do is to reveal what is about to happen at the time of the real author of the book. Okay? So let's say, just for example, that this book is actually written around 200 BC. So what I'm saying is somebody in 200 BC, a Jewish writer, writes a book or a piece of literature that purports to be from Adam. And Adam is predicting the future leading up to and right at, particularly events right at about 200 BC. And that's how you can tell when the book is actually written, because that's when those events that are described are taking place. All right? And what it really deals with, yes, it kind of talks about the end of the world. It's a cataclysmic end. But the reason why it's a cataclysmic end is because what this piece of literature is foretelling or foreseeing, or purportedly foreseeing, is the end of a period of oppression and suffering. And the point at which the rescue of the faithful will take place. So it's written for, and just to take some example. Well, let me go ahead and finish off the features, and we'll talk about how this works with Revelation and with Daniel. So it uses, Apocalyptic does, symbols, symbolic titles, symbolic numbers, like the number 7 is real big in Apocalyptic. The number 40 is real big in Apocalyptic, or multiples thereof, right? And then it uses animals, beasts, but also mythic animals, dragons, that kind of thing. So animals, numbers, titles, even names from the past. And the source of these titles and names and numbers is usually largely the Bible itself, or maybe other pieces of Apocalyptic, but often it's very much the Bible itself. So the number 7, the number 40, those are big numbers in the Bible too. 40 is a common number for a generation. 7 is a common number for kind of completeness, fullness. Mainly I think because there's 7 days in the week. There may be other reasons as well, but 7 is kind of a big number. But not just from the Bible, but also from mythology of the ancient Near East and of Greece and Rome. So it will make use of those symbols, those titles as well as in addition, it also uses terms that are sometimes unfamiliar to us, but they are known to the audience at the time the book is written. Titles. I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. Right, and then all of these symbols are interpreted for the person receiving this vision or this dream. So for Adam or for Enoch, they're interpreted by a supernatural figure, by an angel. Or in the case of the book of Revelation in the New Testament, an angel, and by Jesus that interpret what these things mean. So these are all symbols of things that are purportedly going on in the heavenly realm, to which Adam or Enoch or the figure, whoever is receiving this, is actually being transported, is being given this guided tour of these events. And the idea is that that's the real world, and we're just seeing a kind of a reflection of it in our own history. All right? So the point of all of this is to reassure the people who are at the time of the real author in 200 BC or 100 BC or whenever this is, to reassure those people that their suffering is about to come to an end. If they're suffering under a government, under a government oppressor, then you see the idea is that government that seems so powerful and they seem so powerless, that government, that oppression is going to come to an end. If they're suffering under a tyrant, an emperor or something, that oppression is going to come to an end. And it's going to come to an end in a cataclysm because, it's a world power. But that it's going to come to an end because God is actually on the side of the sufferers. the Jews who are being oppressed, the Christians who are being oppressed. All right? And so it's reassurance. God is on your side. God is the one who's in control, not this empire or this power, this oppressive tyrant, whoever this is. The end is in sight. You know, it might not seem like it to you now, but the end is in sight. It's going to be over soon, and you'll come out on top. You'll be victorious. You'll be rewarded. Okay. You know, maybe some of this speaks to you now. You know, I don't know what your political views are, but maybe there's something here that you can find some reassurance. But here's the point. So the people who are the target audience are people who are in crisis at the moment. They're people who are suffering, who are under world domination and oppression. And so in Daniel, in the case of Daniel, I said it dates about 165 BCE or BC. This is a period of what's called the Maccabean Revolt. Maccabees were a group of Jews, priestly family, who led a revolt against the local authority, whose name was Antiochus IV, called himself Epiphanes. That is, he was the epiphany of a deity. He was claiming divinity for himself, and he oppressed the Jews because they didn't worship him, because they didn't worship the and they were not loyal to him, and he was frankly probably insane. He was crazy. He was one of those megalomaniac rulers. But Jews were being oppressed in part largely because of the Maccabean revolt. So the book of Daniel, the second half of Daniel, is actually written to followers of the Maccabees who are engaged in this revolt, who are suffering under this oppression, right? In the book of Revelation, the audience for the book of Revelation, which I'll talk about more in just a moment, is people who are feeling oppressed by the Roman Empire. Christians who are feeling oppressed by the Roman Empire. And it's not so much, in this case, it's interesting because it's not so much that the Roman Empire is actively oppressing or persecuting Christians at this time period. That did happen, but it was actually fairly isolated. But it is rather that the Christians to whom John is writing, to whom the book is addressed, feel not only kind of government oppression, but cultural oppression, in the sense that they see statues of Roman gods and statues of Roman emperors rather, everywhere. And so they feel culturally oppressed by the Romans. So the oppression can be real, as in the case of Daniel, and as sometimes happened in the Roman Empire, but it can also be felt, it can be perceived. And the reason why I point this out is because you can look around today and find friends and neighbors who will be talking about the end of the world. You can see it on television. You can hear it on the radio about people talking about the end of the world and the signs of the end and all that sort of thing. And these are people who live in very nice houses and drive very nice cars and aren't exactly, being oppressed. But they can still have this perception that the culture is against them. That our laws and our policies are anti-Christian. And they will adopt this apocalyptic mindset. So you can see that going on. All right, in the case of the book of Revelation, the New Testament book, in the first two chapters, It is addressed to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and they are listed. And you can see them in the highlighted yellow section: Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Smyrna, Ephesus, right? And one of the things you notice from that is, you know, if you're not familiar with the geography and so on, you read over that and it's the 7 churches, but you don't really pay much attention to where they are. 7, first of all, is one of those symbolic numbers, right? So you could say, well, you know, it's meant for all Christians or something. But in fact, if you look at the map, this is a pretty isolated area. In other words, John's audience is very specific. He's talking to Christians at about 100 AD who are in a relatively small area of the Roman Empire, and who feel in that area some kind of oppression, real or simply perceived, by the local authorities. All right? And that explains why it is that in the first 2 chapters of the book of Revelation, there are names and titles and symbols that are used, some of which we don't understand. Right? Let me show you what I mean. In those first 2 chapters, well, specifically in chapter 2, there are references in the book of Revelation to a group called the Nicolaitans. We don't know who they were. Have no idea. There's no reference to them outside of this book or outside of these couple of verses. They're obviously some kind of group who follow somebody presumably named Nicolaus, but what their teachings were, whether they were a Christian fringe group, whether they were a Jewish group, whether they were a political, we don't know for sure. And the reason we don't know is because the book of Revelation is not originally written for us. It's written to these people in this relatively isolated area of what is now Eastern Turkey, right? There's another phrase used in the 2nd chapter of Revelation called Satan's throne. Well, we don't know exactly what that is either, but there are hints. It's called Satan's throne. That's a good hint that it's probably bad, you know, that this is something meant to be associated with evil. And then throne suggests an imperial power. So probably a good guess is that this is the local Roman authorities, local Roman, governor maybe, or something like that. Okay? Then we have these other 2 figures, the teaching of Balaam and Jezebel. Now, both of those names, Balaam and Jezebel, are names that are taken from the Old Testament. These are characters from the Old Testament. So Balaam is a prophet or seer, a diviner really, in the book of Numbers, who is hired by a king of Moab to curse Israel. And he keeps telling his employer, I can only do what God lets me do. So every time he's supposed to utter a curse, he utters a blessing instead. But he really wants to curse Israel so he can get paid, basically. But he can't, because he's at least in a sense a genuine prophet or diviner, right? So he's kind of a deceitful figure. Jezebel, you probably know that term, is the queen of Israel at one point, who is from Phoenician roots. And she is described in the book of Kings as a wicked queen who leads Israel astray. Now, again, the writer of the book of Revelation is not referring to those old characters from the Old Testament. The writer of Revelation is borrowing their names for somebody at that time, at the time of the whenever the book of Revelation is written, around 100 AD. So that writer is reusing those names, Balaam, Jezebel, to refer to something among those 7 churches of Asia, of Eastern Turkey. And we don't know for sure who or what exactly these titles, these names are referring to, but it's being reused. And the reason we don't know for sure is because we're not the original audience of the book of Revelation. We weren't among those 7 churches of Asia, all right? So everything John is talking about is addressed to them. All right, symbols. There are other symbols in the book, and I'm just going to go ahead and lay these out because they can be confusing. But if you think about it, and just put a little thought in there, you recognize more of these symbols than you probably give yourself credit for. For example, lamb. Who would you guess that's a reference to in Revelation?
That'd be Jesus.
I'm sorry? I just didn't hear.
Jesus, I would say.
Yeah. Exactly, Jesus, yeah. So the lamb in Revelation is a symbol for Christ, all right? How about serpent?
The devil?
Yeah, exactly, the devil, right. And dragon, probably the same way, a reference to the devil or Satan. And dragon is a term, a word that comes from mythology, from ancient Near Eastern mythology, all right? Beast, probably a reference to the Roman Empire. Again, beast, not good. You know, it's pretty easy to take these symbols and put them in 2 lists, good and not good, right? So the lamb, good, 7, mostly good, but 7 is kind of the symbol for completeness, for fullness. Living creatures, maybe they're a little ambiguous, but lamb good, dragon bad, serpent bad, beast bad. Horns, whenever they're used in apocalyptic, typically represent royal figures, royalty. So the horns in Revelation probably are references to Roman emperors. Okay, so these symbols are adopted. And one of the reasons maybe why the apocalyptic uses symbols is because one of the things it's doing is countering the power, the government power that's in power at the time. So you kind of like to hide what you're saying a little bit. And if you're not Jewish, if you're not Christian, if you don't have that background, you might not pick up exactly on what it's saying. All right? All right. Let me take one of the most famous symbols in Revelation that everybody gets worried about. And that's 666, you know. Well, who is 666? The Antichrist, the quintessential evil one. All right. This is the use of numbers as symbols. Now, if 7 is the number for perfection, for completeness, for wholeness, then 6 would be just one short of that and kind of be quintessential imperfection. Now, 6 becomes the number for bad, for evil. So 666, perfect imperfection, very bad, right? What's curious is when you look at the book of Revelation and it gives you that number, there's also a textual variant. Some manuscripts have 616, and that's an important clue as to who this person probably is. Okay? And I should pause and say that in the history of interpretation, you know, if you go back to the Great Disappointment and Hal Lindsey and all these others, 666 has been used, you know, just about anybody you can think of in Western history, or maybe in world history, has been identified as 666, as the Antichrist at some point, you know. Mikhail Khrushchev, probably John Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, you know, the Pope, just about anybody you can think of, somebody has found some way to identify them. In the book of Revelation, the way this works, let me just show you quickly how this works. So it only works, first of all, with the Hebrew alphabet. It's not going to work with the English alphabet, but just to show you how it would work if you take the English alphabet. You take the first 9 letters. You know, when we write our numbers, our digits, we sometimes call those Arabic numerals because that's their origin. They come from Arabic. In the Hebrew Bible, ancient Jews didn't use Arabic numbers. What they did was to use the letters of the alphabet to write numbers. So the first 9 letters of the alphabet would be the numbers 1 through 9. The next 9 would be by tens, 10 through 90. And then you start on the hundreds and go as far as you can. And then you use words basically to say larger numbers, all right? So just for purposes of illustration, you know, Trump would be T-R-U-M-P. You can take each of those and you can figure it out and you come up with 700, right? Or Biden, you know, it just works. You come out with 70, right? So just to show you, neither one of those comes out to 666, although I'm sure there's some way somehow to manipulate the numbers. All right. So who is the 666 in the book of Revelation? Probably Nero, the Emperor Nero. Why? Because in Hebrew, the name or the title Caesar Nero, Caesar Nero, or Caesar Neron, it could be written one of 2 ways, with a final N or without a final N. And with a final N, the total comes out to 666. Without the final N, the total comes out 50 less to 616, right? Nero persecuted Christians. Now, one of the things that it's important to understand is when the book of Revelation was written about 100 AD, Nero was long dead. He had died in the 60s. All right, so he'd been dead 30 plus years at that point. But because he persecuted Christians, because there was this myth, this idea floating around that he was so bad as an emperor that he might be coming back, you know. You have a reference in the book of Revelation to the beast whose wound had been healed, maybe an allusion to Nero coming back, this Nero redivivus, Nero coming back to life. So because of those things, Nero becomes the symbol of all Roman emperors, of the imperial evil. And if you want a good example, Nero is, in terms of Star Wars, Nero is the empire, you know, or the emperor, the evil one. Dun, 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 right? This is Nero. That's a good illustration of what Nero is in the book of Revelation. All right. So if we're talking, you know, in terms of interpreting Revelation for now, the thing I would say is Revelation, again, isn't written for us. It's really, if there's ever literature in the Bible that is irrelevant to us, probably the most irrelevant literature in the Bible is apocalyptic. And the only thing that, or maybe the good thing to take from it, is the message, the ultimate message, that which Daniel was talking about. Daniel, our leader, was talking about, not Daniel the book. Daniel, our leader, was talking about in his prayer. That is comfort. Comfort in the belief that God is in control. That's the message, okay, of apocalyptic. However, just for fun, let's say you want to stick with and find some relevance to the book of Revelation. I just got to thinking, I just got to playing with the numbers, you know. So I thought I'd do this, and I thought I'd end this way because, you know, that way I'm out of here and I'm safe, all right? So if you follow the English alphabet, you know, 6, A, B, C, D, E, F would be F. 60, you can start counting by the tens, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. 600, you know. So, you know, I'm just saying, okay?
Thanks, Steve.
Sure.
Yeah. Steve
Yeah.
was a major reason for the way this was written was because like of fear of the authorities and needing to be cryptic.
That may well have been the reason for the use of a lot of the symbols, and maybe just originally until you know, after the genre kind of gets going and catches on, becomes popular, that practice continues, maybe even when there was less danger in some situations. But yeah, probably so. You know, when apocalyptic has its origins, say if we take our period when it flourishes a little before that, say 200 BC or a little before that, these are Jews who are writing this, and they're well aware that the only ones who are going to be able to understand what they're writing about, these names, symbols, and so on, are going to be their fellow Jews. So yeah, it's a good way to kind of hide what you're saying from people who are outside of that group.
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Apocalyptic literature has to deal with people suffering in difficult times, but are there any elements of humor in apocalyptic literature, of either irony, not necessarily ha-ha humor, but cynicism, that sort of thing?
That's a great question. I don't know right off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised. I'd love to find something like that. It's not exactly cynicism, perhaps, but one way that apocalyptic is sometimes described is that it is, excuse me, in terms of the worldview, it's really very pessimistic. In the sense that the idea behind it is that seems to be that if history continues in its course, it's very bad, you know. The only way that there can be any kind of redemption or salvation is a direct intervention from God. So in that sense, it's kind of pessimistic. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's some cynicism and some humor. I think I'm gonna have to think on that, and actually the next time I read some apocalyptic, I'll try to keep that in mind and see if I can find some. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you. Ed.
Ed, you gotta unmute.
Unmute.
Hang on. Yeah, Ed, you're on mute. We can't hear you if you wanted to talk. Hang on.
On the left bottom of your screen, there's a mute you can click on, and it looks like a little microphone.
Yeah, or if you're in Windows, you can do Alt-A, or you can hold down on the space bar, but I can't unmute other people. You gotta, oh, hang on, he's connecting to audio through a phone.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Hang on. But it automatically, oh,
Unmute, there I am.
oh, hang on. Okay, go ahead.
No, I was wondering about,
Why is this? All right, I'm gonna mute everybody else, just a second. All right, maybe it would be better if you type your question in the chat. I don't know why it's not working today.
Perhaps we're having an apocalyptic moment.
Yes, it's the War of the Worlds again.
That's right. Extraterrestrials. Well, thank you. And if you have additional questions, you can send me emails. I'll be happy to respond.
Steve, your colleague Kendra has called the Gospel of Mark apocalyptic. Would you agree?
There is that's often a term that is apocalyptic is often used that way for the Gospels and for Jesus as an apocalyptic figure, in the same sense that apocalyptic and that Jesus in the Gospel speaks about ushering in a new age, a new era. So in that sense, yeah. And there are sections of the Gospels. There's a specific chapter. I think in Mark it's chapter 13, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke each have a section that is called the Synoptic Apocalypse, in which Jesus talks about the end, and it's framed in sense of the end of the world, although it's the end of the world, the end of Jerusalem, is what he's really dealing with in that chapter. And that's a very important chapter because it's used often to date the gospel, those gospels, because Jerusalem is destroyed in 70, and so many most New Testament scholars would date those gospels after 70 AD. So it is, yeah. She's using the term correctly and properly, and it's a very common use of it. it's a broader definition of apocalyptic than just in terms of the literary genre, if that helps.
Well, all right, we're at time. Thank you, Dr. McKenzie.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. McKenzie.
Good to see you all again.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.